Hi, I'm Max Keiser. This is the Keiser Report. You know, we've been right for so many years, and there's just so many ways to demonstrate how we've been right. Charts, graphs, attestations by various experts, including ourselves. Stacy, graphically, what are we talking about today?
Well, we have some charts here to show you what has happened after 50 years of Fiat. If you see my eyes are a bit runny, I have had some giggling fits as I look at these charts. I don't know why, but it's giving me the giggles of 50 years of Fiat. Remember, in 1971, August 15, Richard Nixon slammed shut the gold window. It's known as the Nixon shock. And I'm going to look at this first chart here. 50 years later, it was the shortest recession ever. So that little recession we had from February 2020 to April 2020 was just 2 months. It's the shortest recession in history. And I thought, you know what? With the accelerated parabolic printing of fiat money that we've seen, especially since 2008, but every single little dip in the markets. Remember, it used to cause, back then, it used to cause a pretty substantial crash on the markets for any sort of intervention. When Max worked in Wall Street in 1987, it took a 20% crash, over 20% crash in one day. Well, now it takes like like less than 2% crash and they start intervening. So I think in the future, you know, everyone will suffer 15 minutes of recession.
So what happens when the length of the recession goes to zero? What's another word for that? Pop quiz. Recession is zero time in length. What do you call that? What is that word? It's called communism, right? Only in communism or state-run countries, they have no recession, but they also have no way for anybody to have a life other than being a slave. So, okay, that's where America's headed.
Certainly, it would seem that it would eventually start to invite a sort of zombie economy, right?
Right, it's a zombie economy. So in other words, volatility is the stuff of life. You need volatility to create life. Because if it's just one, like the EKG machine, you notice if it's going like this, that means you're dead. You know, what fish flow with the current? Dead fish, right? EKG of a healthy person, ding dong, ding dong, ding dong. That's volatility. That's the volatility of life. Look at the salmon spawning in the river. Woo, woo, woo. You see, it's volatile because it's alive. It's alive. If you're trying to reduce volatility in your economy, you're trying to create either one, a prison, two, a slave ship, or three, America in the 21st century.
That's many of the Western economies, including Europe, Australia, all the English-speaking language sort of economies, and the interventions are greater and greater. In the United Kingdom, it's pretty amazing the amount of debt they've had to accumulate to make sure that the economy stays like constant. There is no recession. The recessions are business cycles, right? They used to be what was called the business cycle, and poorly run companies would go out of business. And unemployment might rise, yes, but that would force people to move to where jobs were, and it would reallocate capital and labor in the economy. We don't have that anymore, and they hope to eradicate recessions for good. And you can see that in this next tweet here from Charlie Bilello. 1, stocks, all-time highs. 2, home prices, all-time highs. 3, incomes, all-time highs. 4, job openings, all-time highs. 5, U.S. core inflation, highest since 1991. 6, Fed, we need 0% rates through at least 2023, and trillions more in bond buying to boost asset prices and increase inflation.
So let's be clear about that. So these markets and asset prices are at all-time highs in fiat money terms. Okay, so whenever you have a dictatorship or an authoritarianism, as you do in the United States now, you've got the top dogs who get free money from the central bank, and they bid up prices on their assets to all-time highs. And then you have now a permanent underclass of wage slaves that are, you know, scrounging for a ham sandwich, who are part of the poor that's growing quite rapidly in a lot of countries, including the U.S. So that has to be taken in context, in fiat money terms. If you look at the Bitcoin world and Bitcoin wealth, it's a completely different picture. But in terms of fiat money, this is what is characteristic of a dictatorship, an autocracy, whether it's Saudi Arabia or the United States.
So the thing is, we've talked about the fourth turning. We talked about this sort of cycles outside of the control of the command and control central bank. So you have generational cycle that can't be stopped, even though their entire wealth has already been spent via debt, right? That's just pulling forward all the consumption for the past 50 years. It's coming due. The generation is arriving. Generation Z is here, and they're here to say, we're not going to stick with this program, right? On the other hand, you have the Thucydides trap. That's also 50 years in the making. I think it was 1972, wasn't it, that Nixon went to China, started to bring them into the global economy. Then, of course, in 2001, they became part of the WTO, unfavored nation status. So these are cycles that are all coming to a head, and you can only control one part of the cycle, perhaps.
Right. The cycle, that is the recession, has been effectively managed or canceled through central bank machinations and manipulation of the money supply and the co-option of the bankers by authoritarians. But the bigger cycles that you're talking about there in terms of the fourth turning, as it's called, or the Thucydides trap, which is a multi-decade kind of cycle. These cycles, like the cycles of the planets, cannot be changed using fiat, by dictate, by pronouncing the sun will rise in the west. That's not going to work. So at some point, like putting a beach ball underwater, a little kid, he's pushing the beach ball underwater. At some point, they can't do it anymore, and it pops up to the surface. So no matter how much the central banks try to pretend that there's no inflation as a result of the money printing, and no matter how many imbecilic, senile idiocies the President Joe Biden utters by trying to push that beach ball of inflation underwater, at some point his feeble lettuce hands give out, and the inflation's like, you know what? It's actually out of control.
I like the way that you said that recessions have been canceled, because it does make sense that all of these, the domestic, at least on the domestic front of this 50 years of fiat, and of course the US fiat is the most important because it's the world's reserve currency, but the cancel culture that has emerged in the last few years of its life seems to be not accidental. It seems to be a natural progression out of a desire to control all, to agree that the dollar is still king.
Yeah, the cancel culture is part of the millennial generation, seems to be really in favor of the cancel culture. And the Generation Z that are just getting out of college now are actually cancel culture. So with the Generation Z, they're actually going to start to see a return to hyper volatility. Millennials already are into Bitcoin. The Z generation is not yet firmly onto Bitcoin. That will change, and then you'll have two generations simultaneously heavily into Bitcoin. And then you'll see fiat money, which is already freaking out. The central banks are already resorting to pure neo-feudalism to try to control the wildfire that is Bitcoin, and that will fail.
Remember, we just pointed out that stocks are at all-time highs, home prices at all-time highs, incomes at all-time highs, job openings at all-time highs. Well, he also juxtaposes that headline, that tweet, with this chart here. The Fed's balance sheet hit another record high this week at $8.24 trillion. So this is really the chart to look at for 50 years of fiat. This is pre-2008, pretty flat balance sheet. Then it jumped up, kept on climbing slowly. And then we saw that little tiny taper when they tried to taper the Ponzi. And obviously it didn't work. Fortunately, perhaps for these money printers, there was a global lockdown and pandemic, but the balance sheet has certainly gone parabolic, exponential.
Right, another way to look at that central bank balance sheet would be the apartheid wall, the financial apartheid wall getting higher and higher and higher and excluding greater percentage of the population. And just like all cycles tend to revert to their mean, the apartheid walls eventually collapse. And so again, on the other side of that would be a bond collapse, a rise in interest rates, the Gen Z inheriting total chaos that they have to reconfigure reality from, and a disenfranchisement of the baby boomers, who by that time are already falling off the demographics chart entirely. Something like 20,000 a day are dying. So they're trying to hold on to that last glimmer of the post-World War II American century, buy it, shop till you drop mentality. But we're in the final throes.
Again, you can't taper a Ponzi, and the problem with it is encapsulated in this final headline, because all those plans of actually being able to extract all that equity from those record high house prices and record high stock prices is you need new suckers to come in, right? Well, after slashing 33% of the workers in 6 years, railroads complain about labor shortages amid uproar over slow shipments. So there are a few hiccups in the U.S. economy right now. James Foote, the chief executive of CSX, one of the largest railroads in the U.S., put it this way during their earnings call recently: "I've never seen any kind of thing like this in the transportation environment in my entire career, where everything seems to be going sideways at the same time." They're saying that they did not anticipate that nobody would want to actually work, and that, in fact, a lot of their workers would actually decide to just leave because they were having more money on enhanced unemployment benefits. But we do seem at, again, one of those cycles, like the solar system and the planets revolving around its star, is that the inevitability that the central banks can't control this. They can't control, they could put all this money in there, but at a certain point, if you have to keep on putting too much money, and you're now having to put money in the hands of the consumers, you're going to reach a situation where nobody wants to work to support it.
Right. All the railroads are a perfect example, because it's economies of scale, networks that occupy vast stretches of land mass. They need to have certain economies of scale that work on a very small margin to be impactful or to sustain any kind of profit whatsoever. And if the workers decide to go on strike, then that entire network fails, which has incredible ripple effects due to the transportation of energy and food. And so these workers are figuring out that, A, they do get federal transfer payments from the government that are in excess of whatever wages they would get from the railway. Two, there are so many opportunities now in these microeconomies doing local, sustainable activities, commerce that are within one's community that is fine to aggregate or to make some cash flow. And a lot of that cash flow is going into perfect money like Bitcoin, and with the expectation that in 10 years, that money is going to have gone up 1,000, 2,000, 3,000% in purchasing value. So there's a real dynamic evolving. We're going to take a break, and when we come back, much more coming your way. Welcome back to the Keiser Report. I'm Max Keiser. Time now to turn to James Howard Kunstler, an audience favorite, always got amazing insights. Stacy.
Right. Jim, we are happy to tell you that you are part of our 50th anniversary special of the Nixon shock. That is the 50th anniversary on August 15th. And we're asking our guests just for their general views on basically what your feelings are of 50 years of Fiat.
Well, I look back on the Nixon era with a great deal of fondness. I was a young newspaper reporter, and it was a great time to be in the newsroom. And I remember August 15th, and I kind of miss Nixie now, don't you? Considering that, we have the Night of the Living Dead in the White House. So at least he was a lively fellow.
I didn't know you were a news person in the newsroom, actually, on August 15th. So what was the vibe? Like, was it anticipated? Was it expected? Were people prepared for this? Like, what was the mood in the country like?
I don't think anybody, I think very few people even understood what it was about or even cared that much at the time.
But it was the lead up to basically.
It was a momentous thing. But like many momentous things that happen in history, it kind of just, went over people's head. And, we're talking about the shutting the door on the gold window, correct?
Yes, they
Yeah.
shut the door on the gold
People-
window and basically defaulted to the United Kingdom because
Yeah. I don't think people understood what that meant as a general thing, including educated people. It was just something that happened in the abstract. And, proof of that is that it didn't really become part of the public conversation at all for years and years and years, really, except among academic economists.
Right. I mean, at the time, of course, you were in Vietnam. The country was in Vietnam. There were protests all over the place. I don't really remember the protests, but I'm sure you do if you were a news person at that time.
Oh, yeah.
So we're going to compare
Because I
that.
was draftable,
Yeah. So
but
what
I had
we're
a
gonna-
really high lottery number.
Well, let's compare that to this day and age. But 50 years later, since we went off the gold standard, in 1970, the obesity rate in the United States was 15%. It's now 42.5%. The average real wage is down since 1970. Deaths of despair are way up. But we have a similar sort of stagflation situation, and we have a similar sort of situation of domestic unrest. Back then, describe what it was then, because it seems like from the footage I watched, it was like the ordinary young person against the government. Now we have a weird situation whereby half of the young people are with the government and with the FBI and CIA against another half of the population.
Yeah, it was certainly a curious thing that, the left at that time was against tyranny and against despotic action and against censorship and against so many of the things that are now characteristic of the left. And, I never considered myself a person of the left, but I was a registered Democrat. And, I can't identify with that faction at all anymore. So it was it was a time that, looking back, looks like it was relatively orderly, despite the fact that we were engaged in this foreign war. It was a kind of a tough economy for a lot of young people. And I'm writing a book about that now called Young Man Blues, about my own youth. But, I eventually was employed as a journalist. And it was, the music was good. It was probably, 1971 or 71.
71.
1971 was a great year for music, and I ended up only a few years later working for Rolling Stone, just at the time the disco came out. So that was kind of a bad development for me.
Right. So what's nostalgic about the Nixon years is that you did have a response from the free press. There was a press that was doing a vigorous job in investigating the White House at that time, which led to the resignation of the president. And you also had an adherence to the Constitution. So the whole case went to court, and the precepts of the Constitution were applied vigorously. And that's kind of what people, I think, are nostalgic about, is that there was a guy, the president, who broke laws, and he ended up resigning. These days, we do not have an impactful or meaningful press in any sense of the word. And to me, this represents a catastrophic failure across many, many aspects and parts of our culture and society, Jim.
Of course, the Watergate thing hadn't started in 1971 when we went off the gold standard. That didn't start until after the election of 1972. And really got going in 1973. So that was a different thing. But, it's hard to really understand what's going on with our press today unless you subscribe to the idea that somehow the Chinese are possibly influencing them in some way, because otherwise it's such a massive institutional failure that you can't account for it by, just a simple ideological failure. It's something much deeper and more dangerous about it, and certainly, looks kind of treacherous as far as our country is concerned. There's no governor in the mechanical sense on any of the institutions that can really do a lot of damage to people, especially the Justice Department, and its stepchild, the FBI.
Yeah, and to make the Nixon reference again, of course, he brought China into world trade, again, setting up for their eventual entrance through the World Trade Organization.
Yeah.
So that's another bookend between now and the 1970s. You know, that now inclusion of China in the World Trade Organization led to, as you write about in your work extensively, massive problems in terms of shipping America's jobs over to China, and the resultant rust belt and loss of any kind of organized labor or wage ability to increase wages, Jim.
Yeah, and at the time that when that process began, we were sending our jobs to Mexico and sending the industrial production to Japan for a while. That's where we were getting our cars in the after the mid 70s, and that process has continued, and it's been extremely destructive. What I notice happening really is that this process of what appears to be kind of the slow motion train wreck of a whole culture is throwing off a lot of what I would call entropic afterburn. A lot of just disorganization, failure, strange things happening that seem to be inexplicable. And yet we're not really capable of doing anything to halt it. And the institutional destruction is so bad that, even availing to the courts doesn't work anymore. So, I don't know how we're going to fix this thing. As far as the money thing is concerned, we're stuck in really a terrible quandary that we've engineered a system that's based on issuing debt in which there's no longer any expectation that debt will be paid back. And you just can't have that. If you have a system based on lending and the borrowers no longer pay the money back, then it's a totally broken system. And it ends up just being kind of an act of magic levitation to keep it going. I don't know how they're keeping it going. And I dare say just about every observer watching it is just kind of stupefied watching this whole infernal machine just click along. But I think many of us are convinced that something bad's going to happen. At some point, when some important, crucial creditor fails to pay back a particular loan, it's going to set in motion some kind of cascade of defaults that's going to put an end to the game. We don't know when it's going to happen, and people like me have kind of given up trying to predict that it's going to happen. But, how could it be otherwise?
Let's pick up on that young man blues, because comparing today to the 1970s, there's something quite remarkable is nobody's working anymore, right? We all have.
Well, the main difference between now and 50 years ago for young people, I think, is that despite the difficulties that people go through when they're young, and we all as boomers did back then, we at least felt that there was some kind of a future. And it's easy to see that young people today can barely conceive of a plausible future. Certainly not one that includes making a living, having a house, raising a family, having something to believe in, caring about your country, and these are all kind of fundamental things. And they are now out the window. So you end up with a kind of vivid nihilism that's being expressed. It was expressed in the streets last year in Antifa and BLM. And we really don't know where it's going from here. But it doesn't look good.
Vivid nihilism, entropic afterburn, these are good words. But I want to continue again on this, the young people. We have a situation where everybody does have a universal basic income. Incomes rose last year remarkably. Average household wealth went up remarkably thanks to huge stimulus checks. That's very unlike the 1970s. Nobody got welfare. Nobody got anything, right? Even the federal government, when Ford, he told New York City to drop dead, right? Let it go bankrupt. But nobody goes bankrupt anymore. Do you think that's a better or worse situation compared to 50 years ago when we were still kind of linked to the gold standard mentality, at least?
Yeah, I think we're just inviting an enormous, large-scale immersion in unreality.
Yes.
And that is never a good thing.
Right. This phrase, entropic afterburner, is great. And to to Stacy's point, you know, going back to 71 and closing the gold window, and then shortly thereafter, Nixon involved in a huge scandal. Is there hubris involved with disassociating your fiat currency with gold? In other words, does gold, aside from its monetary value and as a bedrock of the economy, does it also help people stop from straying into ultra hubris activity? And is it, if bringing gold back, would it instill some kind of, you know, rectitude back?
Well, I think that that was the theory for a couple of thousand years, or at least through the industrial experience, that if you had a currency and it was associated with gold, that it would enforce a certain discipline on both the sovereign nation and on people doing business. And, you know, what we appeared to replace that with after 1971 was the idea that the currency was based on the full faith and credit, not just of the nation as an abstract thing, but on the productive capacity of the nation. And the problem now is that we can't pretend that the productive capacity of the nation is behind the dollar, because we've offshored and gotten rid of the productive capacity. And what's really left is a kind of a nation composed of racketeering of different kinds.
All right, we're going to hold it right there. Thanks, James. Howard Kunstler.
Well, you're welcome.
All right, that's going to do it for this edition of Keiser Report with me, Max Keiser, and Stacy Herbert. I want to thank our guest, James Howard Kunstler of Kunstler.com. Until next time, bye, y'all.